the hardest part at all. Maybe the hardest part was what came after. When the waiting began, and the door stayed closed, and the love I gave so freely didn't find its way back home. And that was the moment I understood that whatever was coming next would change me in ways I wasn't ready for, but could no longer avoid. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman I didn't recognize. She spoke gently, like someone trained to deliver news that might bruise instead of break. She said my son's name, asked if I was his mother, and for a moment my knees felt weak, because when strangers know your child's name, it's never for a small reason. She explained she was calling from a temporary housing office in another state. He had used my number as an emergency contact. Emergency. That word echoed long after she finished speaking. She told me he was safe. That word should have brought relief, but it didn't settle the way it was supposed to. Safe didn't mean happy. Safe didn't mean coming home. Safe just meant breathing. I asked where he was exactly, and she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. He had come in looking for assistance, she said. He was struggling. He had left earlier that day before they could finish helping him. Left. Again, that word landed hard. After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the wall clock. The second hand moved, steady and uncaring. Life goes on even when your heart stalls. I realized then that I didn't know where my son slept at night. I didn't know if he ate warm meals or if anyone spoke his name with kindness. And worst of all, I didn't know if he wanted me to know. I tried calling him again. Straight to voicemail. My message came out softer than I intended. I told him I wasn't angry. I told him I wasn't asking for the money back. I told him I just wanted to hear his voice. The silence afterward felt louder than any argument we'd ever had. The days stretched thin. I found myself talking to the house, filling the quiet with words that had nowhere else to go. I told the walls about the first time my son rode a bike without training wheels, about how he used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, convinced the sky was falling apart just to scare him, about how he once asked me if love ever runs out. I told him no back then. I believed it. One afternoon I opened my jewelry box without thinking. It still smelled faintly like lavender from the sachet I'd tucked inside years ago. The empty slot where my ring had rested stared back at me. I touched it gently like touching a scar. I remembered my husband's hands, strong, careful, how he'd hold mine when words weren't enough. Losing him had been its own kind of loneliness. But this was different. This was loving someone who was still alive and feeling them slip away anyway. I started walking more just to tire myself out. Around the neighborhood, past houses full of voices and televisions and grandchildren's laughter drifting through open windows. People waved. They always do. No one asks if you're lonely. It's not a polite question. And most days I didn't know how to answer it myself. One evening as I was sorting old photographs, I found a picture of my son on my wedding day. He was 5, wearing a little suit that didn't quite fit, grinning like he'd been given a secret only he understood. He was holding my hand, and the ring was right there, shining like a promise. I pressed the photo to my chest and cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to cry since the pawn shop. Quietly, carefully, like grief needed permission to exist. A letter arrived the next week. No return address. My hand shook as I opened it. The paper was thin, the handwriting uneven. It was from him. He said he was sorry. He said he needed time to get back on his feet. He said he couldn't come home yet. He didn't mention the ring. He didn't mention when I might see him again. But he ended the letter with, "I love you, Mom." And that one line kept me breathing for days. I wrote back right away. I told him there was always a place for him here. That the door was open. That I was proud of him for trying. I didn't tell him about the nights I couldn't sleep. I didn't tell him how the waiting felt heavier than the loss. Mothers learn early which truths to keep quiet. Weeks turned into months. Winter came softly that year like it didn't want to startle anyone. I put up the Christmas tree by myself, the same old ornaments, the same careful placement. I hung my husband's favorite ornament last and whispered his name. I wondered what he would say if he were still here. He had always been steadier than me, strong in quiet ways. On Christmas morning, I set out 2 cups instead of 1 before catching myself. I laughed then, a small broken sound. I poured the extra coffee anyway and let it go cold. The letter from my son sat on the table like a fragile thing, already beginning to fade at the folds. That afternoon the phone rang again. My heart leapt before my mind could stop it. It was him. His voice sounded older somehow, tired but clearer. He said he was doing better, that he was thinking about coming back soon. Soon again. I didn't press him. I just listened. Sometimes listening is the bravest thing you can do. After we hung up, I went to the window just like I always did. The street was quiet, dusted with snow, the world holding its breath. I pressed my bare finger against the glass and felt a strange mix of hope and fear settle into me. Hope that he might return. Fear of what returning would cost us both. Because deep down, beneath all the waiting and loving and remembering, I knew something had changed the day I sold that ring. Not just in my life but in his. And whatever path he was walking now was leading him somewhere uncertain. Somewhere that would test us both before it ever brought him home. Continue Section 3. That night after the phone call, I didn't turn on the television or the radio. I let the quiet stay. I sat in my husband's old chair, the one by the window, and watched my own reflection in the glass. An old woman stared back at me, her face lined with years of loving people who didn't always know how to stay. I wondered when I had started looking like someone waiting. Sleep didn't come easily. It rarely did anymore. My mind kept replaying my son's voice, the way it wavered just slightly when he said he was doing better. A mother learns the sound of her child's truth long before she learns the sound of his lies. I told myself he wasn't lying. I told myself he was just afraid. Fear can twist words into shapes that almost look like hope. In the early hours of the morning, I got up and made tea. The kettle whistled too loudly in the quiet house, and I winced as if I might wake someone. Old habits linger even when there's no one left to disturb. I carried the mug into the living room and sat on the floor, leaning against the couch. That was where I used to sit when my son was small, playing with his toy cars, narrating whole worlds into existence. I could almost hear his voice if I closed my eyes. Days passed again, measured now not by the calendar but by small signs. A missed call. A short message. A pause that felt longer than the one before. He sent a text one afternoon saying he'd found work, just temporary, just enough to get by. I reread it so many times the words began to blur. Work meant structure. Work meant purpose. Work meant maybe, just maybe, he was finding his way back to himself. I wanted to help more. That urge never left me. It pulsed in my chest every time I thought of him eating alone or sleeping in unfamiliar places. But I had nothing left to give that wouldn't cost me something I couldn't replace. The ring was gone. The savings were thin. All I had now were words and love and patience. Patience is a strange gift. It looks gentle but it asks everything from you. One afternoon while sorting through an old drawer, I found a receipt tucked between yellowed papers. The pawn shop receipt. I don't know why I'd kept it. Maybe part of me believed I'd go back one day, money in hand, and reclaim that small circle of gold. The date stared up at me. It hadn't been that long ago, yet it felt like a lifetime. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back where it had been. Some dreams are easier to keep folded. A neighbor knocked on my door that evening bringing a plate of cookies. She smiled kindly, asked how I was doing. I said I was fine. We all say that. It's the word we use when explaining would take too long. She chatted about her grandchildren, about a family dinner planned for the weekend. I nodded, smiled, listened. When she left, the house felt quieter than before she came. That night my son called again. His voice sounded closer somehow, like he might be calling from a place less far away. He told me he'd been thinking about coming home for a visit. Just a visit. He wasn't sure when. He said he didn't want to be a burden. That word cut deeper than he knew. Children don't realize how much their absence weighs compared to their presence. You're never a burden, I told him. My voice held steady, even though my hands were shaking. You're my son. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very softly that he missed me. I closed my eyes and let that sentence wash over me like warm water. Missing goes both ways, but hearing it spoken makes the ache feel shared. And that matters more than people think. After the call, I stood in the bedroom and opened my closet. My husband's coat still hung there untouched. I ran my fingers along the fabric and whispered that our boy might be coming home. I didn't know if I was asking for permission or offering reassurance. Grief blurs those lines. Winter deepened. Snow piled along the sidewalks. The world moved slower, as if giving everyone time to think. I found myself imagining the sound of the front door opening, the familiar weight of my son's footsteps in the hallway. Each time a car slowed outside, my heart lifted, then settled again. Hope is patient, but it's also exhausting. Then one morning, a letter arrived with a postmark from a town I didn't recognize. My hand shook as I opened it, fear and excitement tangled together. Inside was a short note from him. He wrote that he was planning to come back soon. Not just thinking about it. Planning. He didn't give a date. He never did. But the word itself felt solid, like something you could stand on. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after reading it, staring at the chair across from me. I wondered what he would look like now. Whether the years had marked him the way they'd marked me. Whether he would notice my bare finger right away or avoid looking at my hands altogether. I started cleaning then, not because the house was dirty, but because preparing felt like believing. I washed the windows. I aired out the spare room. I found his old mug in the back of the cabinet and placed it at the front. Each small act was a quiet prayer. But beneath the preparation, a worry began to grow. What if coming back wasn't what he needed? What if home reminded him of everything he was trying to outrun? Loving someone means wanting them close, even when closeness might hurt them. I didn't know how to hold both truths at once. That evening, as I folded freshly washed sheets, the phone rang. I answered, already breathing faster. It was him. His voice sounded different this time. Unsteady, like he was standing at the edge of something. "Mom," he said and paused. I waited. I had learned how. "There's something I need to tell you," he continued. And in that moment, with the clean sheets warm in my hands and the house prepared for a return that might not come the way I imagined, I felt my heart brace itself. Because I knew, suddenly and clearly, that whatever he was about to say would ask more of me than the ring ever had. I sat down slowly, the way you do when your body knows something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. I held the phone close, as if distance could soften the words that were coming. He took a breath and I could hear the room around him, echoing unfamiliar, a place that didn't know him the way I did. He told me he had been sick. Not the kind of sick you rest off in a few days, but the kind that steals your strength a little at a time and makes you feel like a stranger inside your own skin. He said he hadn't wanted to worry me. He said he thought he could fix it on his own. My son had always believed that. Even as a boy, he'd hide his scrapes until they bled through his socks. He explained the money hadn't just been for rent or food. It had been for tests, medicine, a chance to keep going without collapsing in the middle of the life he was trying to rebuild. I closed my eyes as he spoke. Each word felt like a small weight added to my chest. I thought of the ring again, of how heavy it had felt in my hand that morning, and how light it felt to let it go. I understood then that I would have sold it even if I'd known all this. I would have sold more. "I didn't want you to think I came back just because I needed something," he said quietly. I wanted to tell him he could need everything and it would still not be too much. But I didn't say that. I let him finish. I let him tell me he was getting help now, that there were good days and bad days, that he was scared. Hearing my grown child say he was scared broke something open inside me that I had kept carefully sealed for years. We sat in silence for a moment after he finished. Silence can be kind when it's shared. I told him I was proud of him. The words felt too small, but they were true. I told him he didn't have to protect me from his pain. That mothers don't stop worrying just because children stop telling. He laughed softly then, the way he used to when he felt exposed but relieved. After we hung up, I stayed at the table, my hands folded in front of me, staring at the grain of the wood. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to shield my children from hardship, not realizing that hardship finds its own way. I wondered if I had mistaken distance for freedom, silence for strength. That night I dreamed of my husband. He was younger, the way he'd looked when we first met, his hair dark, his eyes full of plans. He stood in our old kitchen, leaning against the counter watching me. "You did right," he said, before I could ask him anything. I woke up with tears on my face and a calm I hadn't felt in a long time. The next weeks passed differently. Not easier but steadier. My son called more often now, sometimes just to talk about nothing. About the weather where he was. About a meal he'd eaten. About a man he'd met at the clinic who reminded him of his grandfather. These small details felt like threads stitching us back together, slowly, carefully. I sent him letters, real ones written by hand. I told him about my walks, about the neighbor's dog that barked at leaves, About the way spring was starting to push against winter's hold. I didn't mention the ring anymore. I didn't want it to be a shadow over his healing. Some sacrifices are meant to stay quiet. One afternoon I found myself at the pawn shop again. I don't know what led me there. Habit maybe. Hope. The man behind the counter looked up, recognition flickering across his face. I asked about the ring. He checked his records, shook his head gently. It had been sold. Gone. I nodded, surprised by how calm I felt. I thanked him and stepped back out into the light. Walking home, I realized something had shifted. The ring had been a symbol, yes, but it wasn't the love itself. Love had moved on, changed shape, found new ways to exist. It lived now in phone calls and letters and the sound of my son breathing on the other end of the line. He told me one day that he was thinking seriously about coming home. Not just for a visit. To rest. To heal. To be near someone who knew his silences. My heart leapt and steadied all at once. I told him the house was ready whenever he was. I meant it in every way. As the days warmed, I found myself sitting by the window less. I still watched, but I wasn't only waiting anymore. I was living in the spaces between calls, tending to myself the way I'd always tended to others. I cooked meals I liked. I read books all the way through. I allowed myself moments of quiet joy without guilt. And yet, beneath the calm, there was an understanding growing inside me. Love doesn't always bring people back the way you expect. Sometimes it brings them back changed. Sometimes it brings them back only for a while. And sometimes it teaches you how to let go without closing your heart. The day he finally told me he had a date to return, a real date with a train ticket and a plan, I stood very still, afraid to move in case the moment slipped away. He said it softly, like he didn't quite trust it yet. I wrote it down as soon as we hung up, afraid my memory might fail me. I began counting the days, not with desperation but with a careful hope. I washed his sheets again. I placed his mug on the counter ready. I stood in the bedroom and looked at the empty space in my jewelry box, then closed it gently. Because I knew now that what was coming next would not be a simple reunion. It would be a meeting of two people who had both given something up to survive. And I didn't know yet whether we would recognize each other when the door finally opened. The morning he was supposed to arrive, I woke before the alarm, my heart already moving faster than the rest of me. The house felt different, like it was holding its breath. Sunlight crept through the curtains, touching the walls in places it hadn't reached in months. I lay there for a moment, listening, half expecting to hear footsteps that weren't there yet. I moved slowly that day, carefully, as if rushing might undo something fragile. I made the bed, smoothed the sheets I had washed so many times in anticipation. I set 2 cups on the counter and stopped myself from taking one away. This time I let them both stay. Hope had earned that much. As the hours passed, my thoughts wandered back over the years, to moments I hadn't examined in a long time. The arguments that had seemed small then. The times I'd told him to be strong when maybe he just needed permission to be tired. Parenting doesn't come with revisions. You don't get to go back and adjust the lines once life has already read them aloud. The train was due in the afternoon. I checked the time more often than necessary, my hands restless. I sat by the window again, but this time the waiting felt different. It wasn't empty. It was full of memories and fears and a love that had learned how to survive disappointment without turning bitter. When the phone rang, my heart jumped, but it wasn't him. It was the train station, calling to say there had been a delay. Not long, they said. Just enough to make the afternoon stretch thin. I thanked them and hung up, pressing my hand to my chest until my breathing steadied. I told myself delays happen. Life is mostly delays when you think about it. I made soup, something warm and simple. The smell filled the kitchen, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like it belonged there. I caught sight of myself in the microwave door and paused. My hair had gone almost completely gray. My face looked older than it did in the photographs I'd been holding onto. I wondered what he would see when he looked at me. I hoped he would still see home. The knock on the door came quietly, so quietly that for a moment I thought I'd imagined it. Then it came again, soft but certain. My legs felt heavy as I walked to the door. I rested my hand on the knob and took one last breath of the life I'd been living alone. When I opened it, he stood there, thinner than I remembered, his shoulders slightly rounded, like he'd learned to make himself smaller. His eyes met mine, and for a second, neither of us moved. Time folded in on itself. I saw the boy he had been, the man he was, and the space in between. "Hi, Mom," he said. That was all it took. I pulled him into my arms, careful but desperate, afraid he might disappear if I held him too tightly. He smelled like the road and something faintly familiar. Something that reminded me of childhood laundry and old summers. He hugged me back and I felt him tremble. Inside, we moved around each other slowly, like strangers learning the shape of a room. He set his bag down by the door. I offered him soup. He smiled and said he'd missed it. The way he said it made my throat tighten. He sat at the table, looking around as if the walls themselves might speak. We talked carefully at first. About the trip. About the weather. About nothing at all. There were so many things we could have said, but neither of us knew where to start. Sometimes silence is safer than truth. As the evening wore on, he grew tired. I could see it in the way his eyes lost focus, the way his hands rested heavily on the table. I told him to rest, that we could talk tomorrow. He nodded, relief flickering across his face. I stood in the doorway of the spare room as he lay down, watching his chest rise and fall. I hadn't done that since he was a child. I realized then how much of motherhood is learned in moments like that. Quiet, observant, full of unspoken promises. Later, alone in my bedroom, I opened my jewelry box again. The empty space didn't hurt the way it used to. It felt settled, like something that had served its purpose and been released. I closed the lid and turned off the light. But sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept circling the same thought. Bringing him home was only the beginning. Healing is not a straight path. Love doesn't fix what life has worn down. It only makes the walking less lonely. Sometime after midnight, I heard him moving in the hallway. I opened my door just as he stopped outside it. He looked unsure, like a child waking from a bad dream. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "Neither could I," I replied. We stood there, facing each other in the dim light, both of us aware that the hardest conversations were still waiting for us. And I knew as I stepped aside to let him in, that the real cost of the ring, the part one hadn't yet paid, was about to be asked of me in a way I hadn't expected. He sat on the edge of my bed, his shoulders hunched, his hands folded together the way they used to be when he was a boy in trouble. I waited. I had learned that waiting, when done with love, could feel like an embrace instead of a demand. The house was quiet around us, the kind of quiet that listens. "I don't know how long I can stay," he said finally. His voice was low, careful, as if the words themselves might break if spoken too loudly. I nodded, though my heart tightened. I told myself not to interrupt, not to rush him toward comfort. Comfort is not always what people need when they're trying to tell the truth. He spoke about his illness more openly then. About the days when getting out of bed felt like climbing a hill with no top. About the fear of becoming someone who needed more than he could give. About the shame that crept in when he looked at his life and saw how far it had drifted from what he once imagined. I listened, my hands resting quietly in my lap, feeling each confession settle into me like a stone dropped into deep water. "I didn't come back just to be taken care of," he said, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I don't want to be your whole world again." I understood what he meant, even if it hurt. Children grow up and leave so they can become themselves. Sometimes when they return, it's because they're afraid of losing that self altogether. I told him he didn't have to be anything but who he was in that moment. That staying didn't mean surrendering his future. That resting wasn't the same as giving up. He looked at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing me not just as his mother, but as a woman who had lived a long life filled with choices and consequences. "What about you?" he asked. "What did it cost you?" I thought of the ring, of my husband's hands, of the quiet mornings and the lonely evenings. But I didn't list those things. I told him the truth as simply as I could. I told him it cost me something I was ready to let go of. That love sometimes asks for things we don't realize we've been carrying until we put them down. He swallowed hard. I could see the guilt rise up, sharp and immediate. I reached out and took his hand before it could harden into something heavier. "You don't owe me repayment," I said. "You don't owe me becoming someone else. All I ever wanted was for you to keep going." He stayed with me in the room a long time after that, neither of us speaking. The clock ticked. The night moved on. Eventually he went back to bed, and I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how love stretches across generations, thinning and strengthening at the same time. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. He rested. I cooked. We shared meals without ceremony. Sometimes he talked. Sometimes he didn't. I learned to read the signs of fatigue in his face, the way his eyes dimmed before he said he needed to lie down. I learned not to hover. Care is a delicate balance between presence and restraint. One afternoon I found him in the backyard, sitting in the old chair my husband used to use, watching the leaves move in the breeze. He asked me about his father then. Not in a casual way, but with a depth that told me he was searching for something steady. I told him stories I hadn't shared before. About the mistakes. About the silences. About the way his father had loved fiercely but quietly. He listened like someone gathering pieces of himself. As the weeks passed, his strength came and went. There were good days when we laughed, when he helped me with small chores, when he talked about ideas for the future without fear in his voice. And there were bad days when the house grew heavy again, when he withdrew into himself, when I could feel the old urge rise up in me to fix what could not be fixed by effort alone. I reminded myself often that I was not responsible for his healing, that loving someone does not mean absorbing their pain until you disappear. This was a lesson I was still learning even after all these years. One evening he came into the kitchen while I was washing dishes. He stood quietly for a moment, then said he had been thinking about leaving again. Not running this time. Choosing. He had been offered a place in a program out of state, somewhere that specialized in long-term care and rebuilding. He said it with hesitation, like he was testing the words to see if they would hurt me. I dried my hands slowly. I didn't speak right away. The truth rose up in me, steady and unexpected. I felt pride. I felt fear. I felt the familiar ache of letting go. But beneath it all I felt something else, trust. I told him I was glad he was thinking about what he needed. I told him that home would still be here. That love doesn't end when distance begins. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, there were tears there he didn't bother to hide. That night, after he went to bed, I stood alone in the living room, touching the back of my husband's chair. I realized then that the ring had not been the last thing I would give up for my son, but it might have been the thing that taught me how to give without losing myself. And as I turned off the lights and prepared for another night of waiting, different now, quieter, more honest, I knew that the final part of this journey was close. Because loving someone means learning how to say goodbye without turning love into a wound. And the morning that would ask that of me was already on its way. The morning he left, the house woke before either of us did. I could feel it in the way the floorboards creaked, in the way the light slipped into the hallway as if it already knew what this day was meant to carry. I made coffee quietly, the familiar motions grounding me, reminding me that I was still here, still standing, still capable of beginning again even when something was ending. He came into the kitchen dressed and ready, his bag by his side. He looked steadier than the day he arrived, not healed, not finished, but steadier. That mattered more than perfection ever could. We sat at the table together, sipping coffee we barely tasted. There was no rush in our movements, even though the clock said there should be. "I'm scared," he admitted, staring into his cup. "So am I," I said, and it felt right to say it out loud. He smiled then, a small, grateful smile. "Thank you for letting me come home," he said. "For not asking me to be anything else." I reached across the table and took his hand, noticing how much like his father's it had become. "Thank you for coming back," I replied. "Even for a while." When the taxi pulled up, the sound of it settling at the curb felt final in a way I hadn't expected. He hugged me long and hard, and this time I didn't worry about holding him too tightly. Some moments are meant to be held exactly as they are. I watched him walk down the path, then turn once more, lifting his hand in a small wave before getting into the car. I stood there until the car disappeared from view. Then I went back inside and closed the door gently behind me. The quiet returned, but it wasn't the same quiet I'd lived with before. It wasn't empty. It wasn't waiting. It was full of memory and meaning and a love that had proven it could stretch and survive. I sat in my husband's chair by the window and let myself feel everything at once. The sadness, the relief, the pride, the ache that would probably never leave entirely. Later that day, I opened my jewelry box one last time. I looked at the space where the ring had been and smiled softly. That ring had traveled farther than I ever had. It had carried love forward when I couldn't. It had done its work. I realized then that my son hadn't failed to come back. He had come back when he needed to. And he had left again not because he didn't love me, but because he was finally learning how to live. As evening settled in, I made myself dinner and ate slowly, listening to the quiet hum of the house. I felt older than I had in the morning, but also stronger. Life had taken much from me, yes, but it had also trusted me with love deep enough to hurt and still remain. I went to bed that night alone, but not lonely. And as I closed my eyes, I whispered a quiet thank you, for the ring, for the waiting, for the return, and for the courage to let go. Because sometimes the greatest proof of love isn't who stays forever. It's who comes back when it matters most. The days after he left unfolded gently, like pages turning themselves without asking me if I was ready. I kept expecting grief to rush in all at once, to knock the breath from my chest the way it had before. But it didn't. Instead, it arrived quietly in small moments, when I reached for an extra cup without thinking, when I heard a sound in the hallway that turned out to be only the house settling, when I caught myself planning a meal for two and then smiling at my own habit. I learned something then, something I hadn't understood in all my years of loving and losing. Grief doesn't always scream. Sometimes it sits beside you, patient and familiar, like an old friend who knows you'll talk when you're ready. I kept my routine. I woke early. I made my bed. I took my walks. The neighbors waved, and this time when one of them asked how I was doing, I said, "I'm managing." It felt honest. Managing is an art you perfect with age. It means you're still here. It means you haven't given up on the day. My son called once a week at first, then twice. His voice grew steadier with each call. He talked about the program, about the people there, about learning how to ask for help without feeling like he was failing. I listened the way I always had, but something in me had shifted. I wasn't leaning forward anymore, bracing myself for bad news. I was standing upright in my own life. One afternoon, I found myself sitting at the dining table with a stack of old letters spread out in front of me. Letters from my husband, from friends long gone, from my children when they were young and away at school. I read them slowly, letting the words remind me that love leaves traces. Even when people go, what they gave remains. I came across a note my husband had written me years ago, tucked into a book I hadn't opened in a long time. It was short, just a few lines about how proud he was of our family, about how he trusted me to hold things together if he ever couldn't. I pressed the paper flat and laughed softly. Trust is a heavy inheritance, but also a comforting one. As spring turned into summer, I began to do things just for myself. Small things at first. I planted flowers in the yard. I joined a book group at the library. I sat in the sun with my eyes closed and let the warmth remind me that I was still part of the world, not just watching it from the window. I thought often about the ring, not with pain anymore, but with a kind of gratitude. It had been a circle after all. It had come back to me in a way I hadn't expected. Not as gold, not as something I could wear, but as proof that love can be transformed without being diminished. One evening, months later, my son called and told me he was doing well. Not in the careful way people sometimes say it to protect you, but in a voice that sounded grounded. He said he didn't know what the future would look like, but he wasn't afraid of it anymore. I sat very still as I listened, letting his words settle into me like something earned. After we hung up, I stood at the mirror and looked at myself for a long time. I saw the lines, the softness, the strength that had come from years of endurance. I didn't see a woman who had been abandoned. I saw a woman who had loved deeply and survived the cost. I realized then that my story was not about a ring, or even about my son leaving and returning. It was about learning when to hold on and when to open your hands. About understanding that sacrifice, when chosen freely, does not make you smaller. It reveals how much room your heart truly has. That night, as I lay in bed, the house quiet around me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the kind that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that comes from accepting things as they are, without bitterness, without regret. I don't know how many years I have left. None of us do. But I know this. I am no longer measuring my life by who stays or who leaves. I am measuring it by how honestly I show up for each day I'm given. Sometimes in the evenings I still sit by the window. Old habits don't disappear. They soften. But now when I look out, I'm not waiting for someone to come back and make my life whole. My life is already whole. And if my son walks back through that door again one day, I will welcome him. Not as a woman who gave everything and was forgotten, but as a mother who loved, let go, and remained standing. That, I have learned, is a kind of strength no one can ever take from me.